So thanks for listening into this webinar. My name is Holger Dyroff. I'm the COO of ownCloud and at ownCloud since 2012. Before that, I was at SUSE since 1993, which makes it almost 30 years in the open source industry. And today I have the pleasure to talk with you about a data strategy for the future, how we can build a sustainable and reliable strategy for content collaboration in our modern organizations. First, a few generally at the amount of data. We're now really in a world of zettabytes. More and more data is created. By 2035, it is expected that we reach over 2,000 zettabytes out there. And a zettabyte is roughly equal to 1 billion terabytes. And that's really quite a lot. And if we look at it, 80% of that is unstructured data. 50% of that data is sitting in data centers and private clouds. However, already 50% is also located in public clouds today. As of today, there are roughly 4.8 billion internet users. You see there is quite an upwards trend continues to be. There is 1.7 megabytes per second in regards of the data created additionally by one user on the internet out there. And more than 90% of all data has been created in the last 2 years. And there are more than 200 billion devices who already generate data. So data is really coming from everywhere, which has led so far that the International Institute for Standardization was actually forced to do 2 additional categories. So just by the end of last year, quettabyte and ronabyte were specified. A quettabyte is now 10 high 30 bytes. That's really a lot. And I don't think anybody of you has this many data. So let's check with a quick poll. What's the amount of data in regards of content and unstructured, etc., you have in your organization today? It's really interesting that there's so much movement in regards of the data creation. And what we're going to focus on in the webinar is really how we're going to deal with the creation of that data and how we can also get rid of data again by either archiving or deleting it. Okay, so let's see. So most of the people here are in the terabytes and some don't know. That's always interesting. Of course, if you have a data strategy and if you know what to do with it, it would also be a good idea to know how much data you actually have to deal with. So for most of you that's in the terabytes, you haven't reached any petabyte besides any quettabyte things yet. So that's good, but still for you, it will always be more. So besides the pure amount of data, the other areas we need to look at is legal requirements. And we all know, I think, about the GDPR legal requirements around data protection. You should also be aware of any particular laws and agreements regarding your particular industry, which regulate the secrecy you have to keep, the privacy you have to keep, or the confidentiality you agree on with your vendors, with your customers, or with anybody else you deal with. A rather new thing is a European Union directive around the critical infrastructure out there. And this is a new regulation which has just gone into effect as of January 16th, 2023. And we're all now on a deadline for implementation of that by October 17th, 2024. And this new direction for critical infrastructure has a couple of major changes. One is that for the first time, the management of organizations has a direct responsibility for critical infrastructure and thus the data security and the data protection in there. Something that GDPR has always avoided the GDPR is really a responsibility by the organizations, this new directive around critical infrastructure means that for data security, there is now also personal responsibility. And the number of organizations for which this critical infrastructure directive is valid has grown dramatically, because originally that it was supposed or is for about 500,000 users. So if you're an organization where when you are down or away, 500,000 users are effective, it's valid for you today. In the future, this goes down to 50,000 users. So that's way more. That's actually most small energy corporations, water corporations, a lot of hospitals where more than 50,000 users are in their area. If you look also, think about transport sectors and public administration, a lot more people, a lot more organizations will have to adhere to this legislation. And besides many other things, this is something to look at going forward. Of course, you always have your own legal strategy. So one of the first things you have to do when you implement a data strategy is really to understand your business objectives. And I've taken 6 steps here from IBM to go with you through that. So understand your business objectives, and this also means to understand the legal framework you work in. Next, you should assess your current state. Yeah, really understand where your blockers are, where your gaps are, and then map out a data strategy framework. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, what you really personally should do in that regard. Establish controls, create integrated solutions, and of course, scale your team and processes, communicate and work with people out there. But what should really you do in making sure the strategy is aligned? Go ahead and identify your organization's goals and requirements for the data, for all the data you collect, store, and use. Create a data management policy that defines how you manage that data, and particularly how you protect it. When we talked about the different legal things, this is a lot about protection. The GDPR is a protection thing where you need to protect the data of your users. And you should do that throughout the life cycle. And we're going to really go through that complete life cycle of data and how this applies to you as an organization. You should develop procedures to ensure the integrity and confidentiality of data. For that, of course, you need to know what is confidential, what is, which data includes certain types of things, what do you need to do in that regard. You should promote a data culture really designed for transparency as well as accountability. And of course, you should respect privacy and data protection of individuals whose data you collect, and where you should identify for each content if it includes any personal identifiable data. And if it does so, you should probably take that and think how that fits in the life cycle of data versus files and content which don't include any personal identifiable information. Then you should look into technology solutions. Technology solutions like the ones coming from ownCloud, who can help you to improve the efficiency and the security of the data you process. And on an ongoing basis, always evaluate and revise your data strategy to make sure it meets your needs as well as your goals. So let's start looking at the life cycle of data and content. It starts with the creation, goes on with storing, continues with sharing, working with data, collaborating with data, working with many others on the data, archiving or deleting. Those are things you need to think about. So let's look at the details there. Files are created, and there is typically a certain file and document format you choose. You should think about which Office product to create files with. As you might know, ownCloud supports 3 different ones in its solution. You can work with Collabora Online, you can work with OnlyOffice, or you can work with a set of Microsoft solutions, including Office 365. So depending on that, you can think about who is the creator, what are the permissions, should others be able to edit those files? Is it a classified file? Does it include sensitive data? And we talked about all the different data protection things before. Next, you should think about where the files are stored. And besides being created, they can also be uploaded, which is, from our perspective, of course, also an act of creation, which we are keeping inside and also making a note in the audit log files, etc., that data is now created. So where you want to store files and data, you want to store it locally on your people's systems and not being able to have control over that? Is there a network drive? Is there an online storage? Do you need sync clients which might or might not be available for every scenario? And you should think about content that must not be stored and should maybe not be stored on local systems, but only uploaded. And this goes so far from a storage perspective that you could say, in any case, I want that certain content is really only stored inside a technical solution and should never leave the server. And for that, there are solutions like True Secure View from ownCloud, which allows that via Collabora Online, that the content always stays on the server and really only the picture is streamed towards your users, and it can even have a watermark on it. So that's what your data strategy should entail. The next thing is a file is shared. With whom shall it be shared? Should there be controls? Should there be controls in place that your users cannot share with certain groups, that they cannot share with certain people? Is it really necessary to have guest users or other type of users with Gmail addresses there, or should there be some restrictions in regards of domains to be shared with, etc.? Of course, any type of sharing must adhere to the data protection rules out there. And when you work with things, a file is edited, and information might be evaluated, which means a file or a content which started to be not confidential at all, by adding additional information into it, phone numbers, credit numbers, social security numbers, whatever, suddenly they get more elevated in regards of the category they are under and are suddenly including personal identifiable data. What about file locking? Are you making sure that when people work on files that others are not changing the file at the same time, that your work is really protected? And what about meta data, which is added towards, which is tagged by your users? And there are many other sources where metadata could come from. So metadata could come from the file itself. As an example, it could be part of the content, like location data in any picture which is taken from our mobile phones. It includes location data already, and that's something we can work with. It can come from automated processes. So after an upload, the file could go through image recognition, it could go through an OCR analysis or other tools which are able to detect the author and other significant content. Or it comes from a manual editing and assignment of metadata, where what we call tags are put towards it, and the user just says, this is critical data, this is sensitive data, or whatever tags he might want to use. And of course, metadata can also be individual. I, as a person, can decide this is a category I want to put it in, which is, of course, outside of your general data strategy. I, as a user or as a project, can have my own manual ideas and manual assignments, how data is categorized and what I would want to do with it. So if you have to deal with a lot of unstructured data, this type of automations make it possible to bring a lot of things into what we call semi-structured data, which is basically data which originally is unstructured, but by adding metadata, we're able to make it semi-structured so we can do some analysis on it, or we can search for it. And finding data is equally important as creating, storing, and sharing, of course. When we work with data, typically the first thing we want to do is we want to search for it. So here a nice example, searching for a cat. Those type of things are tagged with the right metadata automatically. And then, of course, I can find all of those nice pictures. And last but not least, I have to think about archiving as well as deleting of files and contents. Again, this follows my regulations, my rules, my compliance, the laws I have to adhere to. And I need to understand, do I want to store things forever? Sometimes I'm not even allowed to do that because under data protection laws, whatever includes personal identifiable data, I have to delete when I'm not using it anymore, or the latest after a certain time frame. Typically, people speak about 2 years there. I can archive things in a read-only archive, but I have to think about how long do I want to put it there? Where do I put it? Maybe I want to have cheaper storage for that. In which format do I want to put it? Particularly in public organizations, there are requirements by law that files shall be still readable in like 30 days. So today, typically that's PDF-A, which is used in order to store things for the longer term. Some data needs to be verifiable deleted. Some data I want to delete just to save space. We heard at the very beginning about how data is culminating, how data which is in the terabytes today reaches petabytes and maybe exabytes tomorrow. Maybe that's just too much, and I need to think about how to make it smaller. However, then some data must never be stored from the beginning. Maybe that's very confidential type of things, at least not in all places. And of course, I also have to think about my versioning and my trash bin situations. So often enough, versioning and trash bin is really a lifesaver. Think about ransomware situations where something on your local PC is actually encrypting everything and you're not able to read it anymore. If you have the proper solution in place, you can go back with ransomware protection to a particular date and time on a user or on a project folder basis, and that way go back to a time before that encryption attack started, that ransomware attack started, and have all your data present again to you, which comes from that time frame. And that's often a lifesaver. Then you also need to think what to do with those versions and what to do with the trash bin when you want to archive and delete. So a lot of things to think about, of course. And additionally, you also want a sustainable data strategy. What does digital sustainability mean? Not only green IT, but also that access to content, documents, file data is available years or even decades into the future, as we said, if you're allowed to do so. And for a sustainable data strategy, it's also key to have APIs, because you want your data to be accessible not only from one solution. You don't want to have your data strategy apply to 30 different silos where often data might be sitting today and content might be sitting today. The idea we have for you is that you put everything into a technical solution which has open APIs, which helps you with open standards that other applications can save data there as well and also access data. And that allows a central access and storage for individual applications and also specialized processes and workflows. And it should be designed for the future. When regulatory changes come, you don't want to implement in 20 or 30 different silos those new regulations. Ideally, you have just one where you change things. If you want to keep personal identifiable data for 2 years rather than 3 years, it's one change. Software models might change. You might want to move things into the cloud. Your applications might move to the cloud. They might not be available anymore on site, like many Microsoft applications, including SharePoint, will only be available in the cloud by the beginning of 2026. What do your customers and users want? That's also something you need to keep in mind. Sometimes there is still a need to print certain things. And the definition of critical infrastructure, like we were learning with the NIS 2 directive, are changing over and over. And of course, accessibility is important. We want barrier-free access to data, and again, that's best done through one solution. So we think that ownCloud Infinite Scale and our offerings are really the solution to implement technically your data strategy going forward. And therefore, I'd like to show you 2 things which are kind of new in ownCloud Infinite Scale. One is what we call spaces. Spaces are essentially data rooms which are independent from people. Today in ownCloud, a particular folder is directly ready to a particular person, to a particular user. And here spaces are person-independent data rooms where you can put more than one manager on those. So you can have administrators of spaces who can see the structure but not read the data. You can have space managers who see everything and can invite users. And of course, space participants, that's the ones who you collaborate and work with, like we've seen in our lifecycle management. And from a technical standpoint, we've put a lot of things in the architecture. We've moved from a 2-tier architecture today, which essentially is a server which includes the web front end, and it's kind of mingled together, and a database. We moved into a 3-tier architecture where we have a front end, where we have a server with actually many microservices and a storage backend, and no database anymore, which we call our database-less approach. We're also able to do parallel and asynchronous processing. We are able to deliver infinite scalability for all the data you want to store in the future. And with the microservices, we really deliver cloud-native software written in Golang, a very modern programming language. And together with you, we want to make you, your organization, and all of us ready for the quadribytes. Maybe not necessary today because you're just in the terabyte or petabyte stage, but for the future. And really a sustainable cloud data ecosystem where all the lifecycle things you want are implemented, where we can implement your data strategy for you and work with you together to make this a reality and have this one area for files and content which you can access from all the other places in your organization.